There you go. 1972, what case law? Without your notes. Please. Take out a sheet of paper. Let's do it that way. It'll be okay. Take out a sheet of paper, please. This is to help you. The more you write, the more you remember, people. This is an easy 100. We have, what, 4 weeks left after this? This is an easy 100. Yes?
Versus Georgia.
Are you looking at your notes?
Yes, sir.
Close your notes, please. 1972, Furman versus Georgia. What's at stake in Furman versus Georgia? Standardless discretions, no sentencing guidelines by which the jury can exercise its discretion. So we need guidelines if we're going to employ the death penalty. However, also under that, the court did not say that capital punishment was unconstitutional. It was the way it was being applied. So the court was fine with capital punishment. 1974, Woodson versus North Carolina. North Carolina gives them sentencing guidelines. One size fits all. If you commit murder, you get the death penalty. The court said one size can't fit all. Not all murders are the same. And that brings us to Gregg versus Georgia, 1976. Does it say that, 1976? Okay, cool. 1976, Gregg versus Georgia. We have sentencing guidelines, and there's 3 important facts that go along with it. Anybody want to venture a guess? Besides Rachel, who's reading? Yep.
Separation between sentencing?
Sentencing between trial and sentencing, that's correct. Number 2, automatic appeal, because we want to make sure we're executing guilty people and not innocent people, since this is about justice, not injustice. And number 3, proportionality review. Justice should be applied on a level playing field. You won't see the 9th Amendment, 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection. If you're guilty of the same crime, you should get the same penalty for it. That's called a proportionality review. Anybody remember McCleskey versus Kemp, 1987? This is an African-American man accused of killing a white police officer. He claimed racial bias, and the court agreed. Nevertheless, you're guilty. You killed someone. So the court did not argue with his facts. They said what was wrong was the court was not applying the proportionality review correctly, and therefore sent a direction back to the courts that they were supposed to apply the proportionality principle the correct way. Atkins versus Virginia, 2002. Say again? Again, I'm sorry. Mentally retarded can no longer execute the mentally retarded. It comes out of a case called Perry versus Limbaugh. Do you have the date on that? Did you turn your phone off?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Compliance. Wow. Perry versus Limbaugh, you're under 2002. Atkins versus Virginia. Help everybody out. Do you have it on yours too? You do. When is Perry versus Limbaugh? 19 what? Yes, I'm giving you your notes. Say again? Yeah, keep going over this way. Oh, you don't have the date on yours. Do you have the date on yours?
I'm on your notes, so you don't have the date on yours.
Sure I do. Perry versus Limbaugh. Let me see your phone.
1989.
Thank you. 1989. There we go. Someone's looking at their notes. Say what?
I bet it's on the other.
Perry versus Limbaugh. This is a Texas case where Perry said that he was mentally retarded and shouldn't be executed. It was cruel and unusual punishment. So the court developed a mental retardation test. Perry failed it twice. However, we now have a test that at least the court recognizes as being accurate enough to decide if someone is mentally retarded. If you are not to be executed. You don't go free. John Hinckley tried to assassinate President Reagan, and he is still locked up as far as I know. They did let him go see his mom at one point. So the mentally retarded can no longer be executed, but doesn't mean you go free. Okay? Have I made my point yet?
I think on your notes it had the dates separated because from 1987 McCluskey versus Kemp, then you had Atkins versus Virginia.
Right, but under Atkins versus Virginia, the case starts with Perry versus Limbaugh. It's a Texas case in,
I'm drawing.
oh, you don't have it written down. What'd you say, 1989? So that's when the case really starts, but it doesn't come to its finalization until 2002, and it turns out it's another case that finally brings that to Supreme Court law, Atkins versus Virginia. I cannot emphasize enough, you need to know this stuff, people. And this is an easy 100. It's just facts. Okay, and the only spoiler alert is Gregg versus Georgia, Furman versus Georgia, 2 Georgia trials. Do not take the information from Gregg and get it transposed into Furman, or let me do that. And you go, oh, I remember Georgia, and you need to know Furman versus Gregg. They're both Georgia cases. 72 is Furman, 76 is Gregg. You get that right, you have half your test already. But you have to know that information. Today I want to go over 3 ethicists that are going to have different points of view. The first one we'll go over is a fellow named Igor Primoratz. He's a retributionist. What does retribution mean? What's the aim of retribution? I gave you 4 aims of punishment. Without your notes. Simple justice, remember that phrase, it's in your notes. Simple justice, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's called revenge. Getting even. Is it meant to protect society? No. It does, but that's not the aim of it. So you'll be tested on the 4 aims of punishment, one of which is retribution. Igor Primoratz is a retributionist. You do the crime, you do the time, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Then we'll go over a fellow named Stephen Nathanson. He's got a 3-part argument. He argues against lex talionis, Latin phrase. Anybody know lex talionis? This is the law of revenge, or what we call retribution. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and he's going to show you why it fails in his reasoning. Then he's going to have a utilitarian argument that's going to support not using the death penalty. This man is not for the death penalty. And let's get this right, people who aren't for the death penalty aren't for letting criminals go. You end up doing life, and oftentimes life without parole. And then finally he's going to argue a proportionality review. And
Igor was for death penalty.
for the death penalty, against the death penalty, and then finally Hugo Adam Bedeau. He's also against the death penalty. His argument is interesting, and we'll spend a little time on that. It's called an analogy from self-defense. A very interesting argument. Now, all of these are flawed, but they all have strengths. So when we get done with the nuts and bolts, this is nuts and bolts now, people. I'm going to bring up your lecture notes. There is a PowerPoint, but the PowerPoint just highlights what they say, and the test is going to be more detailed on the facts.
Sir, you said Boudreaux was for or against or for his offense?
ADP against death penalty. But that doesn't mean that they might want to abolish the death penalty, but they're not into letting murderers go free. You do the crime, you have to do some kind of time. Okay? And they're all going to make interesting arguments, nuts and bolts information. Again, if you look at the PowerPoint, it's just going to highlight their points of view, and I'll highlight these after I give you the nuts and bolts. And then we'll also do Stephen Nathanson. The only one that's not on here is Adam Bedeau. I'll go through him in less detail, but I'll make more pointed conversation or comments about what he believes in and why what he believes in is right and wrong. That being said, let's start with Igor Primoratz, okay? He is a retributionist. The argument in favor of simple justice. To the retributive theory, consequences of punishment are irrelevant when it comes to justification. The moral consideration is its simple justice. That's the aim of justice in the law, to punish the violators. So if you do the crime, there must be some kind of time or some kind of punishment that goes along with it. Punishment's morally justified insofar as it's meted out as retribution for the offense committed. You do the crime, you do the time. When someone has committed an offense, he deserves to be punished. The offense is the sole ground for the state's right to punish. If you do nothing wrong, there's no reason we have to punish you. So always, we go over this over and over again in the course. This As long as your hairy toes don't go across the line, you should have nothing to fear. It doesn't mean the system doesn't fail periodically, but for the most part, as long as you keep your toes behind the line, you won't get punished. When you put them over the line, that's when punishment occurs, and you should expect punishment. Everybody follow that? So for him, he's saying the only justification for punishment is you committed a crime. You stepped over the line. You violated the law. The law is there to safeguard those who stay within the box. As soon as you step outside the box, you jeopardize those in the box. Robbing, stealing, cheating, raping, robbing, etc., etc., etc. So the law is there to provide safety, but also justice. And justice requires what? What's the nature of punishment? The first one, unpleasant circumstances or painful. You don't want to go through it, don't break the law. That's your security, as long as you stay within the boundary of the law. So for him, the sole offense, or the offense, is the sole ground for the state's right and duty to punish. It's also the measure of legitimate punishment, and the two ought to be proportionate. So that's where we come to Hammurabi's law. It was designed to make sure the punishment fit the crime. And once we've established that balance, that proportion between crime and punishment, you're allowed to exercise your right to punish offenders in proportion to the crime. So if you kill someone, we have a right to kill you. But if you spit on the street, we don't have a right to kill you. So an eye for an eye, lex talionis, Hammurabi's law, the law of retribution. The uniqueness of the crime of murder has to do with the uniqueness of the value which has been deliberately and recklessly destroyed. So this comes to a Kantian ethic about the value of life. What did Kant say about the value of life? Life is priceless. If you can't put a price on life, it must be priceless. So what happens when someone just destroys that price? You lose that value as well. That's the heart of the retribution argument. When you disregard the value of another human being, you vacate your own value. Now Nathanson's going to say, no, all life has value. He's going to kind of incorporate it in Badeau's argument. We can argue that all day long. The strength of the retribution argument, all life is valuable. It's priceless. It's a Kantian argument. And when you violate someone else's price, when you diminish it, when you execute it and make it worth zero, your value, what's the proportion? Becomes zero as well. And so we have a right to take your life. The guilt of the murder is infinite, because the murdered life is invaluable, because human life is invaluable. To take it entails the death penalty. There's nothing equivalent to the murderous destruction of a human life except the destruction of the life of the murderer. So this is all built upon the law of not only retribution, but proportionality. The penalty has to be in proportion to the crime. It's an excellent argument if you're a retributionist. So he's going to come up with some arguments against it, and then he's going to justify why he doesn't think the arguments are right. Capital punishment is illegitimate because it violates the right to life. Everybody has a right to life, which is fundamental, absolute, sacred right belonging to each and every human being, and therefore ought to be respected even in a murderer. Sanctity of life argument. Why? You have to go back to the beginning of libertarian philosophy. If this justice system is built upon libertarianism, you have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Nothing says if you violate someone else's right, we can violate your right. You have an inviolable right. No one can violate your right. Proportionality justice, retribution justice says, yeah, but you violated someone's right, we have a right to violate yours. But you go back to the initial premise, the initial foundation of libertarian political philosophy, no one can violate your life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness.